Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining. We'll give a couple more minutes for people to join, so we'll start in 2 minutes. Okay, it's 2 minutes past the hour. Good morning, everyone, or good evening, good afternoon, wherever you're joining us today from. I'm Arun Balakrishnan, Director of Products here at Shift Left. And today's webinar is about getting your web apps ready for the CCPA. So let's start with a look at what CCPA is, what it is all about, what does it take to get your web apps ready, the options that exist today, how do you go about doing it, and then Shift Left's take on how we help customers be compliant. So what is CCPA? So CCPA is a regulation, California Consumer Privacy Act, which was signed into law last year, so June 28 of 2018, and it becomes effective in 90 days from now, right? So exactly 90 days from today, Jan 1st of 2020 is when it goes into effect. What it does is it grants consumers rights for how their information is being used. So they get rights to disclosure, they get rights to access what information organizations have on them. They get options to opt out from data being collected. A key thing in CCPA is also equal service. That means if I do opt out of my information not being collected, the service I receive from an organization should not deteriorate. And also rights to remove that information from the records. Now, yes, CCPA is going into effect in 90 days. And organizations need to be compliant, but data breaches in general is not good, right? So the quote on the bottom from a research recently is for small and medium businesses, 60% of them go out of business in 6 months post a data breach, right? So now, what does, or for your organization, is CCPA relevant? Well, CCPA is relevant if you handle California residents' data, right? So handle is you collect, you process, you hold data of any California resident, combined with one of these three criteria. So it's either you have revenue over 25 million, or you handle data of more than 50,000. It could be residents, households, devices, or you make more than 50% of your revenue from selling consumer information. Right. Now, one disclaimer before we go deeper into this webinar is not a legal webinar where we are going through all clauses and conditions of what CCPA is and how it is applicable. We are technology experts here at Shiftleft. So we are looking at it from how do I make the applications that my company has, how do I make them compliant, right? So what does this translate to from a technology perspective? What kind of checks, controls, and validations do I need to put in place so that I am compliant with CCPA? So now, okay, this is what CCPA is. This is applicable for me. What happens if I'm not compliant? Well, the penalties are pretty high. So one, yes, there's a minimum amount that you need to pay per customer per incident. So that is the action damages. But if you see the regulator enforcement penalties, it just says a minimum of 7,500. Like there's literally no ceiling on how much you could be penalized if there is an incident. And even at for the first one, for the action damages, it is per customer per incident. Right? So on the previous slide, when you saw if you're processing like 50,000 records, you need to be compliant. Now multiply 50,000 times 750, that's in the millions. Right? So the damages we are looking at is pretty high. So the penalties are significant. And so it's not something you can ignore from being compliant. And CCPA is just one of these acts. There's a bunch of similar bills coming out across the US over the next couple of years. Right? So very similar to what CCPA is, these are coming out in all these different states. And a look at the timelines. So we started off with GDPR last year. It's been over a year now. And as I said, there's 90 days for California. There's 6 months after that for 4 states, 6 months post that for another 4 states. And most of the other states in the US either have it in their plan or are already going through the process of adopting similar laws. Now, let's look into what it means to be compliant with CCPA. So in order to be compliant with CCPA, again, with respect to web applications and applications that are processing data, it's a multi-step process. So it's very clearly defined in the CCPA. There's many guidelines out there from a legal perspective. And then from a technology perspective, these are the 5 steps to get to a compliant state. So you start off with data inventory and mapping, right? So this is trying to figure out, okay, what is the data processing and selling that is in scope? So I can inventorize them, I can map where all that data is and where it's going. And from a user perspective, you need to provide them rights to data access and erasure. So these are processes you put in place. These are options that you put inside your web app where customers can come in and enable these options. And also the same with step 3 is giving them the right to opt out of these data selling. So these are new controls and features that you would have to add to your applications. And the third is when you work with third-party data processors, you need to maintain new SLAs with them because yes, you are selling these data to these third-party providers, but at the end of the day, if they violate their SLAs, that means you are also not compliant. So you need to update your SLAs with them. And finally, again, from a technology perspective, is any gaps and security issues that you find and vulnerabilities that you find, you need to remediate them. And also to be compliant, you need to prove that your remediations actually work, right? And what Shiftleft can help customers and where we focus on for this webinar is mostly from stages 1 and 5, right? So how do I find where all my data is and how do I fix my gaps in security and vulnerabilities, and how do I prove that these controls are actually working. That's what we'll focus on. So let's start with step one. So step one is identifying where all my data is flowing to. So on the left is a data flow diagram. This is commonly how the engineering organizations would represent data flow in your web applications. And what this shows is, okay, if there is data coming in from a source, it's going through a bunch of processes. In technology or technical terms, some folks call it transforms. And then they flow into what we call as data stores and sinks. These could be log files, these could be databases, these could be sending it back into a customer, so back onto the web page. So this is how data flows between processes in an organization. Now, when we look at inventorizing your data, it is figuring out who uses it. So like what processes and what organizations and what third parties uses it, and how it is being used. Right? So that's what inventorizing means. And then is also we need to figure out, okay, if there is sensitive personal information that we are collecting and storing, are we protecting it? Are we preventing inappropriate sale of these information? Are we preventing inappropriate distribution of these information? And then if it is happening, as I mentioned on the previous slide, fixing those gaps and putting controls. So let me walk you through how this would look like from a process standpoint. So imagine you have a bunch of web and mobile applications, right? So first step is to figure out, okay, what all are those applications? So it's identifying all the consumer-facing applications in your organization. And once you do that, is to figure out, okay, what data am I collecting? So an example here is, okay, you have, say, a web page, a web form, a user is signing up for a new service. So he or she then provides, say, name, social security, address, and then there's a bunch of transactions then they might do on top of it. And so this is the information that you have on the user. And then what you need to figure out is, okay, where is my data then flowing to? So these are all the, what we call as sinks. So it could be databases, it could be blob storage, so your Oracle databases, your S3 buckets, it could be flowing onto your on-prem, it could be flowing into the cloud. So that's from a data store perspective, but it also could be accessible over API. So you might integrate with other services and you might be providing them a hook to get this data out of your systems. So that's API. And then you might be writing these information into log files. So it's important from an engineering perspective to help them with analytics, metrics, debugging the application, ensuring that the application is working fine. So a lot of information often gets written into logs. Now, if sensitive information is going in there, that could be an issue. And it also, as you're providing APIs to third party, you could also be using other services. So you could be pulling in more information, or you could be transmitting these information onto other services. So that also could be another sink. Now, once you've done this, the next is to figure out, okay, where is actually all this information flowing, right? So now you figured out the endpoints, you figured out the information, you figured out the sinks, and then you figured out where exactly are these information flowing into. Now, this would then get you through that stage one of that 5-stage process. Now, in stage 5 is when you figure out the gaps and you put remediation in place. So an example could be these. So imagine an information, say you store SSN in your database. Best practice is to encrypt it before it goes into rest. So you would ensure that the data is being encrypted before it's being stored. Imagine if you're going into aggregators and you're doing this for analytics. So then maybe you don't need the entire information to be stored as is. You could mask it, you could redact it, and it's still useful for analytics. You don't need the entire social security number or the entire address. There are even tools out there, or what engineering teams do is what we call as masking. So you would change like the name and age, etc., to similar numbers, so they don't retain the exact information, but you can still use it for your marketing campaigns and analytics. And if you're passing it on to other services, you could obfuscate it using secret keys and encryption, so that it is not easy to like listen in or intercept it and steal it. So this is what you would do to put those controls. But one thing in CCPA is also to prove that these controls actually work, right? So you would need something like an automated assessment, which would ensure that these things actually happen. So an example could look like this, where a user is sending in social security number, so that is one flow, and then that SSN is then flowing into a log file, and you have put in a redaction control in the path. And so when you are assessing, so this could be as part of your test cycles, your quality assurance, you need to ensure that this flow gets triggered, and you need to ensure that these redactions are happening. And this is one flow. You need to then figure out all the flows. You need to be able to ensure that these controls are working for all of those flows. And not just that, that should then be reportable, right? So you need to be able to ensure that these can be exposed as a report to auditors to prove that, yes, you are ensuring that you've done steps 1 and 5 accurately. So now, from a CCPA perspective, what exactly is the information that you should be looking for? So CCPA has a broad definition of what is personal information, right? And compared to other acts before this, or say comparing to maybe GDPR, GDPR was more on an individual. CCPA broadens it to say information on a household is also part of CCPA. Now, if you can see the list, it's pretty broad, right? So identifiers, so this is any personal information. So you saw examples of this in the previous screen, obvious examples of name, social security number, where you live, how old you are, other information that can be personally tied to you. But it also goes on to things that can be inferred from these to profile you, right? So that's the last category here, where combining some identifiers with where you work, where you went to school, where you live, what you do on the internet. So by collecting maybe browsing history, they could profile you, and that also is the metadata on you. That information also is under the CCPA. And also this from a household perspective, right? So it's not just for individuals. So from a browsing history or from activity that is coming in from a household, can it be used to put metadata on the household to maybe market to you, to advertise to you? All that information, you have the ability to opt out from. Now, so what we have covered so far is a brief idea on what CCPA is, the steps to get to being compliant, and what it would take from a process perspective to go through those stages in terms of discovering, figuring out where this information is flowing to, how to put controls in place, and how to ensure those controls actually work. Now, from a technology perspective, when you're looking at your application, there's some things that should be present in a solution in order to do this effectively. Right? So from our perspective, whatever you use as a solution to see and to be compliant with CCPA should work in development. Right? So once you put this application, your web apps into production, trying to see if there is sensitive data leaks happening, if it can get hacked, that is too late. That is catching up and trying to second guess and trying to react to the situation. In order to be compliant and in order to ensure that you don't have breaches, any solution that you adopt should effectively work in development, work before that application gets out the door, right? Work before it starts managing and handling sensitive information. And not just that, it should also work for every single change and update that you make to your application. So organizations today are much faster with the whole continuous integration, continuous deployment, agile methods of developing applications. What used to take days, weeks, and months for updates to happen, organizations today make updates multiple times a day, right? So say the team pushes out a new feature, they might push out a new product. It cannot be that, okay, you go in and evaluate it and see whether it's compliant a week later, right? So this should be really fast, and it should happen for every single update. And organizations today, when you create web applications, it is no longer all self-contained. You don't create everything in-house. There's a lot of maybe third-party dependencies and libraries and open source libraries and software that you use along with what you create in-house. So whatever solution that you use should be able to look across this entire stack. Right? It cannot just focus on what you create and develop in-house. And then the last piece would be touching upon point 2 is it should easily integrate into your current systems. So if you have a CI/CD pipeline, it should easily integrate into it, and it should be fast, right? So compliance and any controls and any checks you put in place, if it takes a lot of time, if it affects what you do today, not only would it be a lot of resistance within the organization, but also could break the processes you have today, right? So yes, you want to get multiple releases out as soon as possible, but then putting these checks in place, if it is starting to delay them, if it's starting to break them, it is affecting your core business, and so that is not something you want to happen. So now let's look at some of the solutions or the options that you have today to be compliant. So one is manual code reviews, right? So this is where you could go in, you are looking at code line by line, you are trying to figure out all the steps that we discussed early on. So trying to figure out where the data is coming from, trying to figure out all the transformations that happen to the data, try to figure out where it's flowing into. And these applications today, there's thousands of these sources, things, and transforms, and it's literally impossible to go in and evaluate all of these. And imagine you could do it once, but this is not something you could do for every single release. Right? So as I said, like you're doing multiple releases a day, this is not a scalable model to put for every release. So it's expensive, it's time consuming, it's a lot of manpower that is required to accomplish this. The other option is then, okay, let's automate this. Let's just do static analysis of source code. One big issue with this is static analysis tools normally doesn't understand context of your application. So yes, it understands programming constructs and language constructs. It can look at your source code. It can kind of guess what is happening, but it cannot accurately understand what you're trying to do in your application, right? So there are things it would often miss, and even crazier is it often throws out a lot of results, which you then need to go through, weed out all the false positives. False positives meaning the tool thinks it is a problem, but then you go investigate and find out and figure out, well, that is not true. It is not a real issue, right? So both false positives and false negatives. False negatives meaning it doesn't find an issue. Right? So both of these are problems. And the bigger problem is most, if not all, SaaS tools in the market today are painfully slow. Right? When you're looking at big applications with big code bases, with hundreds of thousands of lines of code, if not millions of lines of code, the tools that exist today take hours, if not days, to scan these. Right? So it is definitely not CI/CD ready. You cannot integrate it into a pipeline and let it automatically run for every release, because this is just going to clog the pipeline. It's going to stop releases from happening as fast as they do. And the third option that exists today is trying to put something into production. Now, we already discussed putting something in production is a reactive method. You're trying to block leaks from happening. So you're actually not finding out if leaks are possible. And the like a WAF or a RAS, anything that you put into production doesn't understand your application, right? It is looking outside in. It is not looking inside out. So it's looking at what traffic is coming in. It does not know your source code. It doesn't know what the application is trying to do. So it is often guessing and going off pattern matching to figure out if there is a possible leak of information. And it is also in front of the application. So whenever you start encrypting data, all of those then become time-consuming, expensive. Trying to decrypt all those traffic and inspect everything increases latency, so it deteriorates performance and performance of your application to end customers. And it's also blind to internal leakages. So by that, what I mean is, if your application is leaking information into an S3 bucket or into some log file, which is all behind the application, anything that is in production and in front of the application is totally blind to those. And so it cannot see if those leaks are happening. So let's shift gears and see what shift left offers and then what we can do. So shift left was founded of this technology, our secret sauce called the CPG, that's called Code Property Graph. What it effectively does is, we have a unique way of representing your source code as a graph. And we do it, I mean unique, because we do it in a single data structure. Other solutions out there, they generally create multiple disparate graphs, one for your dependencies, one for your control flows, one for your hierarchies, and then they try to correlate between these and find patterns and give you analysis. What we do differently is, if you see on the right, the CPG pyramid, as we call it, is a single representation of your source code. what it enables us to do is, one, it's way more effective. Second, it's way more resource friendly. So we don't require as much memory and compute cycles as other solutions. And the fact that everything is in one data structure, we are a lot more effective and a lot more accurate in finding results. And second is, it also enables us to do the entire stack. Right? So one thing I mentioned on a couple of slides previously is that you should be able to look at your entire stack, not just what you develop, but also all the SDKs and open source frameworks and dependencies that you use. You should be able to look at data leaks across all these layers. And that's exactly what we enable you to do here at Shift Left. And so this is how we do it. Now, what is that we can provide you? So this is a sample report. We've also uploaded it onto the webinar in the handouts section. You can see the sample report there as a PDF. So what you can see on the screen is exactly the steps 1 and 5 that we discussed in getting to a compliant state in CCPA. The first thing, the sensitive data map, it clearly shows you what information is coming in from the user, where is it coming in, and the data leak is all the flows and leaks that we detect. Right? So we say that, okay, this information is now leaking into a log file, it is leaking into email, it is not leaking into a file, and not just that it's leaking, but exactly point out the line of code where it is happening. Right? So we are pointing out saying, okay, in this source code on this line number is where the leak is happening. Now, another criteria that is required for CCPA is you put a control in place. So there are two ways. One is if it is an actual leak, yes, you could fix your source code. But say if we say this information is flowing into a log file and you figure out that, okay, we need that information in the log file for debugging, for analytics, for marketing campaigns, well, then what you need to do is to put a control in place, right? So then we also do that third step. So that's what you see as the protection measures. We can show you what protection measure is in place and whether it is doing its job, right? So we are saying that, okay, on this line number in your source code, there is a redaction method which is being used, and hence this leak is no longer true. Right? So this combination of a report covers all those aspects of CCPA, from figuring out the data, figuring out the flows, figuring out if you have leaks, helping you fix those leaks, so closing the gaps, and if you are putting a control in place, ensuring and evaluating if that control is actually doing its job. So that's what we do. But we don't stop here. We also provide this over APIs. Right? So what this then enables you to do is, okay, this is not just a PDF report that you generate and you pass it on to your auditors, present it to management. That is one thing. But if you remember what we mentioned, these reports and audits don't happen for every single release. Right? So there's this bigger picture where you ensure that you are compliant for every change you make, for all the analysis that you do. And that's what our APIs enable you to do. So whatever you saw in the report, but now becomes an API, which enables you to integrate into your CI/CD pipeline. So you could have code repositories, like say you maintain your code on GitHub, and then you use something like a Jenkins to build your source code. We can then be integrated into these pipelines so that it is done for every analysis. And we can verify that whether you do have any violations for a particular build or release. Right? And one thing I mentioned earlier is, okay, why do current SaaS solutions not do the job? So two things there. One was speed and one was not understanding your application well. So the code property graph technology that we use enables us to do two things. One, the fact that it is a single data structure and it's way more efficient makes it much more faster. The analysis and the benchmarking that we have done for how we work on code bases, we can do up to 1 million lines of code analyzed in less than 15 minutes. Right? That's off the bat, it's 30 to 40 times faster than the closest competition. So that makes it really fast, and as you can imagine, that enables you to integrate into a CI/CD pipeline. Right? So it's 15 minutes additional to what you used to do compared to hours or days of it blocking the pipeline. And second is the whole, what we refer to as business logic. So the fact that it's a single data structure and the fact that we can look across your entire stack, not just your code, but all its dependencies and frameworks and libraries, enables us to give you insights, which also enables us to understand the context of what you're doing. So we don't stop at just your application. We see where that information is flowing into. We see the entire path, which gives a better idea and clearer picture of how data is being moved around and is way more accurate results compared to a SaaS solution. One of our customers that we were speaking to, it's a major multinational financial services organization. We were demonstrating this because they are also looking at ensuring they're CCPA compliant. And this was the code that they gave, saying what we've built is exactly what they require to ensure their web apps are compliant with the CCPA. So it's not just us saying it, it's also customers saying it. But a public information validating what we can do today. This was just announced yesterday. We are releasing a press release also around it. We just won the Data Leak Detection Solution of the Year from the Cybersecurity Breakthrough Awards for 2019. And this award had, I believe, around 3,500 nominations. So being a winner out of that big pool of nominees validates the capability that we have in the market. One thing we mentioned on the webinar is the free assessment option, right? So yes, we are offering a free assessment. It's a self-serve option. So you can go in, you sign up, you can analyze one application, a Java-based application, and we enable you to create a single report out of it. The signups are due by October 10th, and then once you sign up, it is valid for 2 weeks. So you can run the analysis within that 2-week window. We also have what we're calling as a compliance offering. So this offering, again, the signups are due in a week, and it will work all the way till Jan 15th. So it will work 2 weeks post the effective date of CCPA. It is not self-serve, it is white glove, wherein our team will come, they can help you onboard and ensure that you can use the solution effectively. And then we give you unlimited reports. So it's not just showing you where the potential leaks are, but we go beyond that. You can fix it, you can come back, you can rerun it, you can see if it's getting fixed. You can then go back, put some controls in place, again run reports and see if the controls are effective, so that you can keep working on it till you are fully compliant. That price is per application, and it's also available for more languages, programming languages. So we also support .NET and Scala for that option. And of course, if you're an enterprise and you're looking beyond CCPA, because that is not just what we do, ours is also looking at technical vulnerabilities, business logic flaws, along with sensitive data leaks and being compliant with CCPA, right? So that would be a bigger initiative effort. You might have way more applications. So that's something we work on a one-on-one basis. Again, unlimited reports. There's way more languages that we support, like Golang and JavaScript, that we support for such use cases. And validity is based on how long you buy it for. So it's not a 3-month thing. You could do multi-year deals for that. Right? So that's from an offering perspective that we have for the webinar attendees. And so this is the link that we request you to go and sign up for either the free assessment or also for the compliance package. So you can go to that link, sign up. Somebody from our team will be in touch with you to take you to those next steps. So that's the end of the slides. Just a reminder, so there's a sample report attached in the handouts, and we've also put the link to go and sign up for, so that you can sign up for the free assessment. And then yes, there is the questions section. So please do send questions through there. I've already started seeing some questions. I'll go over them. And then we still have 19 minutes, so please do keep sending your questions. Okay, so there's a comment around WAFs struggling with encryption. Yes, so my point there was more around the additional overhead it takes. So especially if you're using things like elliptical curve, Diffie-Hellman algorithms, WAFs find it tough to work with it. Yes, there are workarounds, but it's way more resource intensive. But the bigger point being it is reactive, not proactive. So that is the bigger issue with trying to solve this in production versus development. Right. So that's around that one. Sorry, I'm just going through the questions. Okay, so what is the CCPA impact for organizations with annual revenue less than or doesn't meet those criteria? Do you think this would change? So the kind of the disclaimer slash caveat I mentioned in the beginning, we are not legal experts, right? So I don't have a legal opinion on that topic. At least from past experience with other laws that I've seen, like things like GDPR and other countries, there are amendments and changes that happen over time. So I'm in the same situation as you are in. I'm not sure if this would change, but yeah, there's a good probability it could. But going back to that first point I made around a data breach is bad irrespective, right? So yes, you might not deal with so much information, but whatever information you're dealing with is sensitive, and having these controls in place and figuring out if you're leaking information and preventing a breach is always the best thing to do. And another thing you can also see is in one of the slides I presented other states are doing the same thing, right? So there are many more states coming out with similar regulations. So I'm only imagining that complying with and protecting US resident information is only going to be more critical as time passes. Right? California being such a big state with so many residents, a lot of our customers are trying to or implement similar controls across the customer base versus trying to delineate saying this is for California customers versus rest of the country. Because from what I hear from our customers is, yes, they would need to be compliant with other states soon. So better have to have a solution that works for everything versus trying to catch up as time goes by. And then one good thing about these privacy acts is the steps that I mentioned, steps 1 through 5, if you take GDPR, if you take CCPA, the steps are almost identical, right? Like what information you're looking at is changing. So as I mentioned, CCPA also looks at household information versus GDPR was more at an individual basis. So those things change. But the fact that you need to figure out where the information is flowing to, whether you have the controls in place, all of those are exactly the same. Okay, so there's a question on how do you handle custom APIs for logging or sending over email. So that's a very good question, and that's something a lot of solutions struggle with. We expose these policies and dictionaries and languages that we use for our analysis for customers to tweak and edit. So by that, what I mean is, imagine you have a custom API or policy that you use to sanitize some information, or a custom policy or API that you put as a control, or a custom thing that you use for sending information, so that becomes a sync. We have ways to mark these, so customers can come in and tweak the policies and add these additional rules. And the opposite is also possible, where imagine we find something and you say, okay, I don't want to look at that because that is a valid use case for me and I want that information to be flowing there. We also provide the capability to mark them, ignore them, so that those results don't pollute your overall analysis. So yes, we can do both of those. The question was, is this a SaaS solution and do we have to upload the source code? No, we don't work off the source code, and the source code never leaves your premise. We work off what we call as metadata of the source code to understand where the flows are and where the information is flowing. And we do have multiple options. So we have a SaaS solution, we have an on-prem solution. So we work the way the customer is comfortable working. So that is not an issue. And as I mentioned, we are working with big multinational financial service organizations already. So we have a solution that should fit your needs. There is a legal question around how do we report a data breach, timelines around it. Again, just going back to that disclaimer, I'm not a legal expert. We here at ShiftLeft are more technology experts. So this solution is not going to help you with the processes and the human aspects and guidelines of CCPA. Those you would need to get help and consultation with a legal firm. What we help you with is from a technology perspective, from your application perspective, how you can ensure your applications are compliant. Right? So that's what we help with. Okay. we've sent out the link for the free assessment again. So as I mentioned, you have time till October 10th. So that's a week from now. So our request is go in, sign up, and as I mentioned, there are two options there. You can sign up for that free single assessment, or you can sign up for a package which gets you through the effective date of CCPA. So you could do either of those. There's a bunch more of questions coming in. So question is, okay, it I think touches upon something we mentioned. It says, my team releases on a daily basis. How quickly can you detect new leakages? Right. So as I mentioned, we are among the fastest in the industry. So the speed with which we can analyze, the number I mentioned, up to 1 million lines of code in less than 15 minutes. That's the fastest we've seen in the benchmarks we do. So you can see new leaks literally within minutes of that being pushed out. So as I mentioned, you integrate this into a CI/CD like pipeline. So these can be fully automated. And as I also mentioned, it's also available over APIs. So you can hook it up to any of the existing notification channels and methods you have in your organization, so that this is not a manual process. It is end-to-end automatable, and you are then looking at any abnormalities and results, and you can take actions on that. And there are a few customers today who also automate it in a way it could even fail a build. And so by that I mean is, okay, you've done a new release, you put in some code changes, that code changes is introducing some new data leaks, and so it violates some of the policies that you have in the organization. We are able to detect that, and we could influence the pipeline, the CI/CD pipeline, and fail the build, so that that product and the release never gets out into the open. Right? So then you can go in, take any necessary action before that build goes out. So that's the response to that. There's another question saying, do I have to modify my source code or my application in order for shift left to work? Absolutely not. You don't need to make any changes in your application itself. The only change customers do is in the build process or the pipeline, as I mentioned, to integrate our solution, which also is very easy and very straightforward. But absolutely no changes required in your application. You're not including changing any libraries. In fact, the fact that we can scan your entire stack, you are in fact also not even changing how you build. Right? So we've heard some customers complain saying their existing solutions required them to build in a different way, reduce the number of dependent libraries in order for these scans to work. Absolutely not the case in our situation. There's a question saying, what kind of leaks do you detect? So we classify it at the high level as sensitive data leaks. That includes and goes beyond what CCPA is looking for. So from the CCPA perspective, all the information that can be tied to an individual or a household. Right? So we of course detect those. We also go on to do other categories. So in our product, we classify it as PII data, that's personal information data, financial data, healthcare data, transactional data, account information. So it also goes beyond an individual. It also could be tied to your business logic, right? So imagine, say you have, you're deploying workloads on AWS. A common issue that we have seen, and this has happened multiple times as breaches in the public, is secret key information that you use to communicate on the cloud gets leaked. Right? So they call it as like AWS secrets or secret keys. we can detect those information too, right? So that is not relevant for like a CCPA compliance, but it is very relevant for ensuring that your application is not getting breached and ensuring that your workloads and applications are safe. So we detect that information too. And then we, of course, go beyond leaks. So as I mentioned, we can do technical vulnerabilities, so SQL injection, cross-site scripting, directory traversal, so all those. So things like OWASP top 10, SANS top 25 kind of vulnerabilities, we detect that. And we also do what I mentioned as business logic flaws. So these go beyond technical vulnerabilities and also go beyond just leaks. This is detecting if your application is working the way that you designed it to. So for instance, if you have, say, certain parts of your application that should be accessed only for authenticated users, so validating whether these pages or areas of your application do require authentication, right? So is there a way to bypass authentication and get to those pages, right? So that's confirming and checking whether your business logic is working as it is intended to. And so that is, we detect those as well. A question around where can I find the list of technologies you support? That's available on the website. And when you sign up, as I mentioned, somebody from our team will reach out to you. And that's the level of conversation we can have it, where we can check what you use today, what you have, can we effectively help you? So that's the level of conversation we can have at that point. A question around, does your tool suggest remediations for identified vulnerabilities? Yes, definitely. So we give you full information on exactly where the vulnerability is within your source base. We point you to that line of code. We give you information to educate you on how those vulnerabilities happen in the first place, right? So what mistakes, how to detect those. We link to all these external resources as well. So OWASP and SANS, so you can read it, more information, look at examples. We also suggest what remediations to put in place so that you can go in and fix it. And then, as I mentioned, in the next set of analysis, you can also look at and validate those remediations are actually happening. Right? So if those remediations, say, imagine we found one vulnerability and then there are multiple instances of it. You put a remediation in place. The future analysis would tell you if that remediation is present for all the paths we found the vulnerability in. So you found 5, and if you put the remediation, but it only affects 4 of them, that 5th one would still show up. So you know that you've missed something. And so we do that. Okay, we are almost to the top of the hour. I think I'll take maybe a couple more questions and then we'll have to end this. Okay, so the question is, does Shift Left do professional services to do the custom examples that I was mentioning? Yeah, definitely yes. So that's something we often help customers with, where so when you put in a custom API or you're putting in custom controls in place, customers often require help in tweaking and making our system work the way they want it to. And yes, that's definitely part of what we offer. So we do have professional services, and we can help you make it work for your application. Right, there's 1 minute left. Let me take that last question. Oh, this is interesting. And yeah, this is something that often comes up, is you're looking for regression testing. And the question is, can we help ensure that vulnerabilities don't regress? Yeah, so this kind of goes back to the checks that I said you could put in place to validate if your controls are working. So the example that I mentioned, okay, we figured out that there's a vulnerability, there's 5 instances of it. yes, you put a control in place. First, it helps you validate if you miss anything, so you can catch it there. But then imagine it fixed all 5 of them, you go on, there's a change in the source code that happens 3 months down the lane, which changes something in the flow. And so now one of these vulnerabilities, the control is not working for one of those paths. Of course, the next first analysis that happens after this change will show this, and you will realize that, yes, you've regressed on one of those old vulnerabilities. So yes, completely, and it's a very valid use case to use shift left solution and regression testing and helping ensure that you don't regress. So that is the top of the hour. So I'm at this point, I'm going to end the webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us. I hope it was useful. The link, I hope you took a look at it and maybe bookmarked it. We will follow up and send that link along to sign up for the free assessment. And thanks again for joining us. Hope you all have a great rest of your days. Thank you.